Meditations with Ryan Zlomek.
Hello and welcome to episode 29 of Meditations. I'm your host, Ryan Zlomek, and as always, this is a show dedicated to making space for conversation just to see what we can learn from those around us. Every other week, I bring on what I think is kind of an interesting guest just to sort of share their life experience, their work experience, their knowledge, their philosophy, to see what we can kind of take away. And today is no different. We have Nicole Austin on the show. She's most known as being the general manager and head distiller at the George Dickel Distillery in Tullahoma, Tennessee. She's currently the director of luxury, working under the parent company of Diageo, but comes from a really interesting history, studying chemistry, doing water treatment, eventually sort of developing a passion for the spirits industry, and then really making waves with her sort of DIY ethic pushed into a major conglomerate. It's super cool. It's a really interesting conversation just about finding passion, figuring out where to apply it, and then having a convergence of great things happen to just throw you in the limelight. So without further ado, let's hear from Nicole Austin. So Nicole, thanks so much for beaming in to Tennessee today. And you are I'm coming to you from your hometown of Central New York. Well, more specifically Syracuse. But what was it like growing up for you just around Central New York? Just in general, give me your sort of like childhood overview.
And I loved it. I didn't realize how much I loved having four distinct seasons until I moved to a place that doesn't have that. I still, it's funny, like in the whiskey industry, so much of it is like smells, and smell and memory are so connected. If you read my like early notebooks, it's all these like apple orchards and hay fields and cider and like apple cider donuts and honey, and you realize how much that place shapes you. So I feel very lucky to have grown up there, and like be around for birth of American hardcore, and like there's a lot. Syracuse punches above its weight for the size of city that it is. I'm glad I grew up there.
Yeah, no doubt. And you're talking to somebody who just has probably an unhealthy amount of Central New York pride. So it's good to know that you're transferring some of that into Tennessee. It needs it, you know?
Oh, huge, huge. My family, my mom's still there, and I love it.
What kind of stuff were you into when you were a kid? Like we're going to talk about your sort of love of horses
Yeah.
later on. But like what are the things that like you really gravitated to as a youngin'?
Reading. I was a huge reader. I remember staying with my aunts. It's a story that my mom loves to tell. My aunt is a teacher, and she's like, "This is the first time in my life I had to tell a kid to put down the book and go outside. Like, stop reading, go outside." I tried all manner of like extracurriculars, but the one I loved the most was horseback riding. My poor single mom was like, "Oh, you want a pony? Like, okay, the most expensive sport? Really? No, like violin is not gonna, no, okay, not gymnastics, no." I had no coordination of any kind. I was a big geek. I was like very much kind of grew up more with adults than kids, and was always more comfortable with that.
Oh, that's fascinating. What kind of stuff did you like to read?
Everything. Of course, when I was young, books about horses, Black Beauty, all the like Black Stallion novels. There was this like Saddle Club series that had like 200 books, and I had all of them. Um, I read all sorts of stuff like science fiction and fantasy and history, and I loved it. Just anything.
That's awesome. And so for listeners out there, Nicole and I do know each other, and that's going to come
Yeah,
out just natively. And we went to high school together.
yeah,
And one of the things I'm curious about is that like I first met you because you were the president of the Acceptance Coalition at Fayetteville Manlius High School, and I'm curious about
yes.
like your sort of gravitation towards like equity and standing up for people who are sort of underrepresented. Like that was my first sort of introduction to you, and I'm curious about like when that became just a part of your being and a part of the way you operated.
I think it's hard to pinpoint. That's an interesting question. I think, I had a real uh, I guess affinity for animals really young, and like uh, my childhood was a bit challenging. There are some traumas there, and I think all of those things uh just give you, even like as a small kid, that simple mindset of like having obligation to something other than yourself, and like having like caretaking and empathy. I guess like having empathy is, I think, the root of caring about equity, right? Like having the ability to think about someone other than yourself and how they might be feeling. So I spent a lot of time, I think that was probably the beginning of it. And then I started to really care. I mean, candidly, like it was just a place I felt like I fit in, which is something that means so much to like a 14-year-old, like people that I felt I fit in with, that the things that they talked about and cared about resonated with me. And so like as silly as it is, revolution and social justice and all those things are pretty big through lines and themes in like science fiction and fantasy. And, you pick up a lot of that ethos, I
Yeah, I
think.
mean, you read old 1960s sci-fi novels and you're like looking at the social themes that they're tackling and you're like,
Yeah,
oh, this is so relevant to right now.
huge. Yeah, huge. I mean, I guess to me, it's more mysterious. Like, how could you not? I don't know. Like, how do you not notice like what's going on? How do you not, sit in a history class or and just start to care about these things? I find that more mysterious than it just seems really natural, like our pathway. But alas, that is not in fact the case. But
Yeah.
I find it more confusing, candidly.
Fair. But it's cool because I think that that sort of ethos and that sort of empowerment is something that I've seen flow throughout your career, which is pretty neat. Another thing, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I'm curious about like your passion for science as well. I mean, we just talked about science fiction and obviously your love of horses and animals. But you ended up going to Manhattan College to get your chemical engineering degree. And I'm curious about when you developed that sort of interest in getting down to quite literally the molecular level of things.
It was what I was good at. It's funny because, at the time when you knew me in high school, like I had so many friends who were really talented, like artists and musicians, and they made such beautiful things, and I was so envious of them, actually. Like I wished I had that kind of talent. And then I was just over here like winning science fairs, and like um I lamented it then. And it just took me a while to figure out a way that I could use that skill set, to make something like beautiful and creative and culturally relevant. But it just was what I was good at. I took really well to math and science. I just understood it. Um, I didn't like epically suck at English or anything like that. I was, because I think I love to read, but it didn't, it wasn't like inciting my passion in the same way. I loved math and science. And then, of course, you go to the guidance counselor's office and they hand you that list of like degrees and the salaries that you would make, and chemical engineering is at the top. And you're like, okay, yeah, I'll do that one. That sounds fine. Like, sure, let's start there. You know,
You're
let's start with the hardest one. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, like, you could always go down from there. And I remember that guidance counselor, man, either a genius at manipulating students or a really terrible guidance counselor. Because what she said to me was like, "Oh, I don't think you have the discipline for chemical engineering." It's like, "I'll show you," So she either reverse psychologized me into success, or she was just rude. I don't know.
It's one of those unanswered questions that we'll be tackling for the next, 3 decades. Uh,
Right?
I just like love the idea that like your career trajectory was dedicated by like alphabetical order. You're like, all right, A's, B's, C, ooh, chemical engineering.
You're like, "Oh, that's a high number." Like, okay, sure, let's try that. Like,
What was your time like at Manhattan College? I mean, I have no doubt that you were like in it to win it in the chemistry department, but like what type of stuff were you studying? What types of things really kind of jumped out at you?
Um, so I love math. I minored in math. I also minored in sociology. So I continued my like interest in and study of like people. Actually, Manhattan College is sort of has sort of an interesting history. They are a Lasallian school, and they had one of the first like peace studies majors that they offered. They have quite a deep like um, Lasallian and religious tradition. And I had an ethics professor who I really loved, Dr. Scott Nicky, who like I took ethics courses with him and really explored that. I did ethics debate because I'm again that nerd. Um, did like independent studies in sociology. So I think I kept the balance, which I really, enjoyed and appreciated. But I had a mixed bag kind of experience. Like they were, I think, similar to FM, like they were not quite willing to flex to my disruption. I started a zine, right? Like as one does, started a zine and you know, continued to push on these issues of justice. And they did not love that. So I had a mixed experience.
What about the actual like chemistry education? Like within that sphere, what drew you, what drew you in?
I understood it. It was easy, being candid. Like, uh, I could do it. And, math I loved math. It was so easy, but it seemed like math majors, you basically end up in like insurance or teaching. I didn't really want to do either of those. So the chemical application, I felt like just offered me more opportunity. I just liked it. Like it made sense to me. It was, it came easy. Like I just was able to follow it, and it felt like, yeah, if you can do this, like why not? You should.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like just in the world of like chemical engineering. First of all, I mean, I'm thinking about you as like, good Nicole Austin, like the sequel to Good Will Hunting, where it's like actually about like a chemistry nerd instead of a math nerd. But
Not quite. I wish. Not quite. Like, but definitely, I just like in high school, if a professor was willing to like give grades based on your understanding of the material, I did incredibly well. If they gave grades based on your compliance with turning things in on time, you know, mixed.
fair. But like, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but like, I think that just in the world of like chemical engineering, it's like you've got like a gazillion puzzle pieces, and you can figure out how to structure them in ways to like make new things happen. Like, it's like you've
Yeah.
got this like very defined set of toys to play with. Like, was that, I mean, because that's obviously something that you found yourself doing later on, but like, were you kind of exploring those spaces at all in college, or was that like did that happen after you got into the workforce?
It's a way of thinking. So I had a wonderful professor who said, engineering is teaching you a way of thinking and a way of problem solving and a way of approaching problems. And she said, you'll know that we've turned you into an engineer when you find yourself like just naturally in your daily life, like plotting the most efficient route through the grocery store, or like choosing a washing machine based on like efficiency metric, because you just will start to think about things always in that way of triaging problems and like the relationships between things and just a very, I guess, like rigorous approach to problem solving. And that resonated with me, the logic of it.
That's awesome. Well, you left there, and then, if I understand, you went into water treatment.
Yeah, water and wastewater. I went to work because, I didn't want to go into like oil and gas, which is where most chemies go, or pharmaceuticals or like weird making food, like food manufacturing, like, going to make like Kraft macaroni and cheese and stuff, like those kind of very processed foods where a lot of chemies go. And none of that really felt good to me. So I went to an environmental engineering company, which I thought I had no idea really what I was getting into. I thought like, okay, I'll make the environment better. Like that's gonna feel good, right? And then you find yourself being like lowered into the New York City sewer and hip waders, and you're like, oh, okay. Like maybe not exactly what I pictured, but still good. Yeah, it was interesting. It was cool. Again, very rigorous engineering because like you have to, you know, getting rid of wastewater for a city of 12 million people is like no small task. And then I also did some work on the water supply side, which was very interesting, and surprisingly low tech.
Can you elaborate on that?
I remember, so I worked at, there's a chlorination facility upstate, and we were doing like mechanical integrity work for them. And so we're just in this little cabin, and there's a reservoir, and you look out and you're like, who's that dude? Right. And it's just like a guy with his dog in a rowboat, like shooting air horns to scare off geese. And like he plays an important role in the protection of our water supply, but it's just like a dude in his rowboat, Like it's it was a funny, it's a funny moment. And you're like, oh, okay, like the safety of New York City's water supply is at least partly dependent on this like retired dude in his boat.
That's an amazing visual. Uh,
Yeah, it was really sweet.
I'll never be able to look at an air horn the same way again. It's going to be that's the protector.
Yeah, it was cute.
Oh, that's really funny. And I gotta
Yeah,
just because I'm inherently curious, like so many stories. I mean, I was watching Ted Lasso, and like part of the story is like we're going down and we're looking at the
yes,
sewage system.
yes, I
Like,
remember that.
what was it like going down and exploring those things like the first time?
I mean, it's amazing. It's fascinating, like the infrastructure that is required to get a city to run, um, and the complexity of it, and just the like monstrosity of it, like how big things are, is really stunning when you see it. It's humbling.
That's amazing. Is it
Yeah.
worthy of all the, the horror and science fiction and kid stories that have happened in the sewers? Is Ghostbusters real, maybe is what I'm
I
asking?
did not, I'm not sure. What is real? Like, who knows? I didn't see no turtles that had been taught any kind of martial arts. Where did I come across? Um, it's not as gross as you would imagine. I mean, it's not gross, but um, it's more like just how much it's like just wild, how big wastewater treatment plants are, and like how much, like millions and millions of gallons that flow through them, and just the scale of it is like awe-inspiring.
Well, we can now go from disease to sterilization as we talk about your journey into the spirits industry. And
Yeah.
when I was doing research on you, the story that keeps coming up is that the way you entered the industry was by going on a date and deciding to ignore your date and talk to the bartender. And
That's
can you tell us that story? Set the record straight. Like how did you get so obsessed? Like what was this personality that you were talking to that like really got you interested in the process of spirits?
We're still friends, actually. Yeah, he was just a really passionate bartender. It was right at that era where, people were starting to, I guess, like appreciate American whiskey and like what it could do. And he was working at a bar that really focused on and put American whiskey front and center. Most whiskey bars were really focused on Scotch at that time. And so he was just enthusiastic and interested, and I was young and like kind of wanting to be sophisticated and wanting to learn things, but not really knowing anything. I didn't know how whiskey was made. Like I couldn't have told you at that time. And he was pouring a flight of whiskey, like pouring some different whiskeys and telling me about them and like educating me about them. And he happened to mention how a particular one was distilled. And distillation is a core of what you learn in chemical engineering, but when you learn about it, like I learned in the context of making jet fuel, like separating different carbon components from one another to make different types of fuel or like make pharmaceuticals. I didn't really realize even that you could use that technology to make something that is as interesting and like beautiful as whiskey. So just the moment he said that, it was like instantaneous for me. It was like, I can use my skills, I can use my knowledge to make something as interesting and beautiful and like culturally relevant as whiskey. I had hungered for creativity in my work since high school, right? Just wasn't good at any of those things. And it was just really exciting to be told that I could apply my own talents and what I was good at to making something beautiful.
Yeah, I'm gonna become slightly egocentric at this moment, but like one of the goals of this podcast is to point out the fact that like there's stories everywhere we go, and I'm just a firm believer that like if you ask people like what are you interested in, or you figure out that thread and you're able to pull on it, oftentimes that can be the center point that completely changes your perspective on anything. And I just think it's so cool that like you found somebody who like, oh, it's just a bartender. Well, this just a bartender like helped, plant the seed for this award-winning brand later on. Like that's just super cool.
He changed my whole life. Like, and just his passion was so palpable as well. Like he was so interested and excited to be learning about it, and he was like excited to share what he was learning. And we talked about it all night. Like his shift ended. We went to the bar across the street. Like we were still chatting about it. I was just so excited, and like it was from that moment, I immediately started trying to get into the industry. Took me a while to actually do it, but
This it will I want to come to that in just a second because that's also its own interesting little narrative. But like you talked about the sort of like talking to this individual and learning about the sort of like history and importance of American whiskey. And like
yeah.
we're gonna delve into that, I'm sure, later. But like, can you just give like a cliff notes real quick about like why this is such an important process for people to sort of pay attention to?
So in history, distillation was critically important, mainly as an outsourcing of agriculture, right? So if you're a farmer, if you're growing things, distillation is a way of preserving them. So, if you have a bumper crop of something or like more than you need, like let's say corn, for example, right? It's much easier to transport the distillate from that corn than it is to transport the corn itself, right? When you ferment and distill, it's now preserved. It can be transported. It's much smaller and lighter. So it's important from that perspective. And then also it was used quite a bit in, early medicine, right? Like uh, I would, we know better than that now, obviously, but at the time it was important for like preserving things like herbs as well, right? Like it itself preserves the crop it came from, but then it acts as a preservative for other things or to extract, elements. So it's important from an agricultural perspective. And then just culturally, it was so relevant. American whiskey is one of those few like uniquely American culinary creations, So much of what we have is like imported from elsewhere, but that unique mix of like what grows here and how it helped form American whiskey into what it is. And that's, it's an AOC, it's terroir, it's something that comes only from the United States. It's a product of the United States. It's our champagne. Like this is what we have. And so there's a real interesting point of pride there. And then just, it was big, funnily enough, in like the creation and funding of the American government as well. Like taxes on whiskey and taxes on spirits were just hugely important, especially, during the Reconstruction era. Like they were, before we had an income tax, that's what we were taxing.
I just love it because I think that like there's so many times where like you can just look at history through one specific narrow lens and like looking at it through the perspective of like the whiskey industry is like one I've never thought about before.
Yeah. There's like the creation of the IRS was they were the first like regulator of the American whiskey industry. They wrote the standards of identity for the first time, like the definitions of what American whiskey is. The passage of the Bottled and Bond Act in 1897, like these were all things that were coming out of the IRS at that time. There's now, it's even still today called the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. So it's like that's who regulates us. It's an interesting, and that was what drove them to, care about protecting this industry because it was such an important source of revenue.
Okay, cool. I'm really glad you did that because I think that's a nice way to just pave the way for there was so much history you could pick up in that one night. And then moving on from there, I mean, you end up working for Kings County Distillery
Yes.
shortly after that. But like what does that interim period look like where you're like, all right, I have this eye-opening moment in this bar, and then you're like, all right, water treatment's cool, but there's this whole other playground I wanna check out.
A lot of writing very perky letters, like I believe I would be a huge asset to your distillery, um, and mostly getting no response. At that time, the American whiskey industry was quite closed. It had been obviously we've gone through prohibition, we've gone through big periods of consolidation, and it was mainly like, six or seven big producers. And craft distillers hadn't really gotten going because the regulatory environment was so constraining. It was really hard to start that kind of business. And this was just starting to change at that time. So I knew I had a better chance of getting in through craft. So I was showing up at like events, early events featuring small distillers, just like introducing myself, carrying resumes around at whiskey tasting events, which is also a nerdy thing to do. And the way I got in at Kings County was I showed up basically the first day they legally sold their corn whiskey and was sort of getting like not frustrated, but like I'm gonna get this done. And I basically showed up and was like, I will work for you. And they're like, okay, like we don't have any money. I'm not sure we can pay you. And I was like, whatever, man. Like, let's go. You're in Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn. I don't have to move. Like, let's do this. And they seem to actually be producing, which was sort of unique at that time. A lot of people were starting small brands by like purchasing from somebody else. And they were actually distilling, which is what I was excited about and like wanting to try.
And if I understand, they pride themselves on being the oldest distiller in New York, right?
Yeah.
And that was 2010.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because they were the first to get a license post prohibition.
It only took a couple decades.
Yeah. Well, that was what had to change. And really that's a lot thanks to the work that Ralph Lorenzo did at Tulletown to change the state level laws to allow for small distillers to get a license.
What type of work were you doing for Kings County?
The job title I gave myself was Master Blender, which was somewhat hilarious because I think we had like 5 barrels at that time. But I was mainly doing like productions. So early on, I was like looking at their production records and trying to organize it to like get some sense of, what was our efficiency and like how could we do better. So I did a lot of that. I did, it's a small business, so also you like mop or bottle or deliver or whatever needs done. But then once we started aging it all, I was blending all of the mature spirits.
How and what's the timeline for maturing products like that you're overseeing?
So we used small barrels, which was quite unconventional in the industry. So the industry standard size in America is typically 53 gallons. Um, and we were using 5 gallon barrels at the time. So quite small. And the big impact of that is it dramatically increases the surface area of wood kind of per volume of whiskey. And that increases transfer, of compounds out of the wood and into the spirit. And it also increases like oxygenation, the oxygen making its way through the wood and into the whiskey. So we were really early. There are a lot of craft distillers that use that because it makes things go faster. Typically in an American whiskey, you have to wait quite a while. 7 years would be like a normal time period, which the cash flow for a small business, like that's not gonna work. So we use small barrels. We anywhere from 6 months to like 2 years. We pushed farther, and at the time, it was actually the first time that there was like an article about us specifically in the New York Times, which was really exciting. Like, like, oh, we're mentioned in the New York Times. It was basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but they're like, you will never make good whiskey that way. And once again, I was like, I'll show you. Like, just because you can't do it doesn't mean nobody can. Like, it was a funny moment.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
like part of the reason I was really curious about that is because it's one of those scenarios where like I think, in a previous interview I had heard that like for George Dickel, where you're currently, the director, like this was a few years ago. I think the oldest barrel you had was 18 years old.
Yeah.
And like to sit there and think about a company that's starting in 2010 and the idea that like their first barrel that you might be able to jump into is 2017, like how do you even make that business work? So the idea that like
Really
this
hard.
yeah,
Yeah.
this small barrel 6 month thing is just a total
Yeah.
game changer.
Yeah, it was. That's one of the things that makes it hard to start a whiskey business. It's a big barrier for entry in terms of like cash flow. If you start a brewery or something, like, you get your brewing equipment up and running, you get saleable beer in about 10 days, Um, and whiskey doesn't work the same. So it's a big challenge. It's a big hurdle that companies try and solve in a lot of different ways.
That's really cool. So one of the things, like I love the fact that you said like the title that I created for myself,
Yeah.
because you've always had this spirit of kind of jumping in and this sort of like natural leadership that has been a part of you that I saw in high school. But like having been in the industry for about 3 years, you helped start the New York State Distillers Guild, for which you were the president of in 2013 to 2015. Like what was that sort of organization's goal, and why on top of trying to enter the industry, what was your interest in like having such a profound leadership role in it?
Um, I guess when you're investing in an industry like this, the time element that we just talked about is so big, right? Like you naturally always have to look forward. You're planning for the future, or you're laying down whiskey today that you might not sell for 7, 10, 15 years. So I think we always look ahead and we always plan. And we're such a heavily regulated industry that it was just immediately obvious to me that in order for us to survive long term, we needed to be working together, right? Like we needed to come together. We needed to have, a voice like in government, and we also needed to help each other. Like it is really hard to start this business. It's it's tough, and I learned from looking at other industries, right? Like we learned a lot from speaking with like the Brewers Association and, their early, like having really candid conversations with them about like missteps that they think the industry had made, or, things that they had done, like why were they successful? The New York Wine and Grape Foundation was massively important in helping the New York State wine industry thrive. So you just look around and realize like we needed this. I felt that I wanted to be in the industry for a long time. I wanted to be in that industry for the rest of my life. And so I needed to try and make sure that there was an industry to be in. And you can't, one business alone does not make an industry, right? Like a whole collection of businesses is what makes that and makes that work. So I cared a lot about it. Also with my engineering background, like I'm quite passionate about safety and keeping people safe. Like distilling can be dangerous. And so one of the early things I did was organize like OSHA trainings and to help make sure that people were being like safe and in that industry. So I just cared a lot about it. I don't know, it was to me it had to happen. It was like a thing that we needed to have happen. So I was gonna go and make it happen.
Well, and it's always good when you're the person who's able to help make the rules and help ensure that like your set of standards is the one that people are adhering to.
Yeah, I am also a bit of a control freak. Yes, yes. Yep.
Let the record reflect you applied that title to yourself, not me.
Yes.
Um, I'm one thing I'm curious about before we move forward to your other sort of just adventures and spirits is that as we just pointed out, like Kings County Distillery starts in 2010.
Yeah.
And you're putting this organization together in 2013. Like by that point, how many distilleries were you guys kind of overseeing and working with?
Question. I think 2013 there were probably about 20. Um, it was, it started kind of slow. I mean, now I think there's over 80 distilleries in New York State, maybe even over 100. By that time, I think there were about 20, and there were maybe like 7 or 8 of us who were operating at any scale, which is hilarious to say because that like, you know, we were like at that time, I think we were running like 35 gallon stills, but operating like, in operation, actually distilling. So it was small. It started pretty small but mighty.
It's the way to do it, right?
Yeah.
You've done a bunch of other things from consulting and working, working with different boards and things like that. But
Yeah.
before making your way to George Dickel, you ended up moving to Ireland
Yeah.
for about a year to work for
2 years. Yep.
yeah, William Grant and Sons, if I understand
That's
correctly.
right.
Um, what was it like getting that international perspective on the way in which spirits are produced across the sea?
That was fascinating because they take such a different approach. Probably my biggest takeaways were they are so much better as an industry about sharing data and sharing it both with each other and also with like universities to really study like what can help make their industry successful, studying efficiency, sharing data to calibrate like even their own efficiency measurements, working together when it comes to managing like the environmental side of the industry and how best to do that. So that was a huge strength I saw of their industry. And I also definitely took away they have a really good deep understanding of specifically the origins of their flavor profiles in a way that American whiskey, I think, because it was a bit secretive, it's like families and family recipes and not really written down in a text anywhere, like we didn't have. So those were some big strengths that I saw. And then also, of course, the European market is so different when it comes to sustainability. The way they sort of encourage businesses to be efficient is really different. So that was an interesting and cool takeaway from working over there, and like just the investment and the way that they ran their plants to use less energy and be more efficient was definitely more sophisticated than over here.
What type of, I guess bluntly, like what was your job when you were there? What were you doing?
I was a commissioning engineer, so my role was essentially to turn it on. So they were at that time they had bought Tullamore and they had built like the brand, and they had built a pot and malt distillery, which is like the shiny one with the pretty copper pots. It's like a really nice kind of visual. But the meat of Irish whiskey is grain whiskey, and they were still buying that in at the time. And so they were building the grain whiskey distillery, which is making this like kind of lighter, more precise and more neutral like base component for that whiskey. And so my job was to kind of liaise with the engineering team as they were building it and make sure that what they were building would be like practical to operate, and then hire and train the operators and then actually like turn it on.
Fascinating.
It was
Uh,
cool. It was a cool like melding of the engineering background and like the whiskey love.
were there any specific products or like product lines that you just like really got excited to always spend some time with?
The fight, so actually what I was really excited about was not having to deal with any of the, consumer facing stuff, like to just be an engineer, like to just be making a certain number of wine gallons of distillate with the exact right ppms of things, like, and not have to really think about or worry or care, like, what the brand is, um, was kind of a nice like break.
That's awesome. And then from there, you decided that Ireland was too rainy and you were going to move to Tullahoma, Tennessee. Uh,
I loved Ireland. That is not, I wanted to stay. I think I would have stayed. But actually, candidly, like working for William Grant was terrible. They were like, that was an awful employment experience. And then just the opportunity for Dickel was like too alluring to pass up. So it was not that I was so desperate necessarily to leave Ireland, but this was just it was like too cool to pass up. It's a once in a lifetime.
yeah, and maybe this is please correct my optics if needed, but I mean, you went from being sort of a cog in the wheel at, in Ireland and at these other little places to like all of a sudden like coming over to Dickel and being like the big kahuna. I mean, you're brought in to make choices and make changes and,
Yeah,
as you've pointed out, like make decisions that are not short term.
that's
Um,
right.
yeah, like what was the allure of going to Dickel, and how familiar were you with the brand before jumping on board?
So actually, the whiskey of theirs that I knew was the white whiskey, the unaged whiskey, which is quite a niche little product. But we made corn whiskey at Kings County, and so it was something that like we were very aware of, right? Like who else actually made good white whiskey, and Dickel's was it was lovely. It was like quite pleasant and sophisticated. So I knew that white whiskey. I didn't really know their mature whiskeys at all, but I guess I was working on the assumption that if it was that good going into the barrel, that like there was certainly I could do something with it. And the thing that really drew me to Dickel was, I think especially when you're in craft distilling, there's such a heart and passion and interest in sort of the pre-prohibition American whiskey industry because that was a time when we didn't have like just a few distillers. We had thousands of distilleries all over the country making really different regional styles. And the image of that kind of heyday is what gave us all a bit of belief that we could be successful as an industry, that there is room, for that in America. And so there's always been a fascination with the history of American whiskey, but rarely do you get to actually touch it. Most of the distilleries that have an authentic through line to that point in American whiskey are already very modernized and expanded and established today. And if you were to come to run them, you'd be somewhat limited, right? Like you're operating they exist, they have an identity. But Dickel, it has that history and connection. It was founded in 1870, like George was a real person. We know physically where the distillery was, and we know that it is in that same spring and in that same site. Like there's a through line there to history and years and years and years and years of whiskey making experience, but it had not already expanded. It was a real unicorn in that it has the history and it has the authenticity and it has the skills and the quality whiskey, but it had sort of been missed, in the bourbon boom. Like no one had really no one to do with it. It was just this like little sleeper that no one had seen. So I knew I could actually come in and make some decisions that would be impactful. There was an appetite for change in a way that like an existing big brand might not have had. So just a once in a lifetime. You can't build this. You can't make it. You can't, no amount of money can create 150 years of history. And no amount of money can buy time, like these warehouses full of barrels that have been aging. So it was just too beautiful of an opportunity to pass up.
I mean, it's awesome. And I remember when you got the position, like I felt like everywhere I was looking, there was so much press written about the fact that like Nicole Austin is coming over and is going to change the face of George Dickel and whatever. Maybe that's the wrong language, but like, how did you respond to that sort of, I don't know, like positivity and intrigue and just curiosity about you jumping on board?
I was a little shocked. I was actually really panicked. So when this was announced, I took a position with Diageo's the biggest, if not, they kind of go back and forth with this other like Chinese baijiu company, but they're one of the biggest spirits companies in the world. And I had come out of craft distilling, like my identity was deeply tied with the American craft whiskey industry, founding the New York State Distillers Guild, help founding the American Craft Spirits Association, like I was a huge part of that world, and I was afraid that they were going to like throw tomatoes at me. The announcement was made while I was at the American Craft Spirits Association convention in Pittsburgh. So this news became public while I was surrounded by like hundreds of craft distillers. And I was so afraid that they were going to be like, sell out, like, how dare you, you're a sellout. And I was like, I sweating walking out of my hotel room that morning. And I was just so shocked. Like everyone was so proud of me, excited for me. like supportive of me. It was, I don't know, it was not what I had ever imagined, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah,
It's
and
good, they're good people
it's
in the
so cool.
industry.
It's so cool. And I think I just two things. One is just in regards to Diageo for people who are kind of unfamiliar. I mean, we're talking Captain
Yeah,
Morgan, Johnny Walker, Smirnoff,
yeah,
Guinness, Bailey. I mean, these are
yeah. Good
yeah,
brands.
yeah. If people who listen know, I don't actually drink alcohol, but I know these brands quite well, you know?
Yeah.
And that's like this is to be in charge of one of these pieces for a company that is saying this needs to be cash positive, this needs to
Yeah.
have good brand recognition, this has to you have to make sure that you make waves in the right way. You're going to be looked at. I mean, this was a huge transition. And the other thing I was just going to say is that like one thing that I'm beginning to really appreciate about our generation is that like, you know, a lot of us come from these places where we kind of do these like DIY things, or we do these projects because we're passionate, we're excited about them, and then eventually like the defined leadership structures that we've kind of like pushed against for so long realize that like we have created the most unique pathway and have the most unique visioning because we followed the things that we're passionate about. And I feel like your tale is such a great demonstration of that.
It's interesting that you talk about that because when I took this role, I was so skeptical, you know, coming out of craft and having that kind of DIY ethos and believing, damn the man, right? Like that big business is bad and small business is good and people are good. And I was very skeptical, right? Of like, would working at a big company, fit with my ethics and ethos, and would I be able to feel good about the work that I was doing there? And I was really surprised, how much better actually it fit with what I think of as like ethical ways of doing business. The thing about small businesses is number one, they're very people and personality dependent, like they're small, there's only a couple people, like, and their character flaws are just gonna drive, we all have them, right? And like they're gonna have an outsized impact on like what it means to work there. There's typically no HR, there's no one ensuring like fairness and equity. There's no one to complain to if you're being mistreated. They're heavily dependent on like volunteers. Sometimes they have sort of a laissez-faire attitude about worker safety, like, and, paying people fairly. And they tend to just like lean on the cool factor in some cases to justify like treating people really poorly, or like not paying vendors, like not, there's just a lot of, and some of it is just the nature of like you have to make tough decisions to keep your business alive, to make payroll, to make sure that your employees can pay their rent. And so that is always such a driving force of like every decision that you make. And even if you're a really good person who's trying to do their best, like that squeezes you into compromises that you might not have had to make otherwise. Whereas, when you work at a business, like that's not my driving consideration. It's so freeing. I don't have to worry about whether my distillery is going to make payroll next week, like that I can, we just take a bigger, wider view. Like we have centralized HR. We have mechanisms for reporting things. Our distillery is unionized, right? Like all of these structures are in place. We pay our vendors, like we act in compliance with the law. Like we have safety programs. It, I thought it was going to be trapping, constraining to work for a big company like this, and actually having those systems in place and like not having to worry about some of the day-to-day things or like whether someone was gonna, light themselves on fire, like not having to worry about those things has really freed me to actually be a lot more creative and like focus on the whiskey in a way that I couldn't before, and feel good also about like the kind of business that I'm doing. It's it surprised me.
That's awesome. What was so Cascade Hollow is the actual physical distillery that you work
Yes.
at. What
Yes.
was it like the first time you stepped foot on that property and you saw all the resources available to you?
Magical. Magical. Like that place is, you're driving through rural Tennessee, definitely questioning some of your life choices. I on the drive there from New York, it was a long drive and I was very tired, but I just like you drive in and there's like a massive Confederate flag that's like 80 feet tall when you cross the border. And I started just sobbing, like, what have I done? But when you go like physically going to the distillery, you enter this like beautiful hollow, this beautiful valley with this like crystal clear stream running through it. And this distillery just like appears like out of the fog and down this windy road, like this mythical, magical place. And then you go in there and just meet all these people. I was really skeptical of how if they would support me taking that role, like some Yankee coming to run this like heritage Southern whiskey distillery. But they all took such pride in the whiskey they were making. And I think they really like let me in. And they're like, if you respect this whiskey and you think it's good, like, and you're gonna help grow this place, like we're happy to have you. And they really accepted me. And it was just magical. And the history just drips off of that place. Like you just, from the moment you walk in and there's like a plaque, about like the historic significance of this site, and you can't not notice it. It's really, there's literally like a heron that comes in every afternoon, like fishes in the creek, and it's just magical.
I feel like for any tourists out there, they do tours. Um,
Yes.
what so when you got there though, like, and I'm gonna apologize if I'm screwing this up, but like you got in there and you already started making changes pretty early on. And like one of the
Yeah.
things that I think is really interesting, having listened to some other interviews with you, and just, as we just talked about the idea that like the average whiskey maturation is about 7 years from like start to release of the product.
Yeah.
You obviously didn't get in there and you weren't able to be like, we're creating this new product and it's going to be on shelves in 6 months. Look at my product. You had to look at the existing product line, the way in which things are being communicated to customers. And one of the first things you did is you started to switch language around in regards to what was considered a bourbon and what was considered a whiskey. Is that correct?
Yes. So when I took this job, basically the challenge in front of me was this big bourbon boom had happened. Like bourbon was growing, selling, but Dickel had been functionally flat for like 20 years, which, they were kind of, I think the company was a little bit astounded by. Like, even if you don't invest in the brand, it should at least sort of get like pulled along with everybody else. And so that was part of what I was basically tasked to solve. And first you're just learning, right? Like what's going on here? Like I thought it was an awareness issue. I was totally wrong. It actually beautifully, it went back to one of my other weird passions, which is the regulatory environment and like the code of federal regulations and naming. And Tennessee whiskey is a regional identity of bourbon whiskey, but most people didn't know that or understand that. And so I spent some time in the beginning basically going on like every podcast in all the land, all the whiskey podcasts, or every event, and explaining that to people. Tennessee whiskey is a type of bourbon. If you're a bourbon enthusiast, like you should also be exploring Tennessee whiskey. I then I saw some data about exactly how many humans live in the United States, and like realized that to reach 221 million people of legal drinking age, like my podcasting was not gonna get there, and that there's just some realities that you run into. And also, once you're referencing the Code of Federal Regulations, like most people are not listening to you anymore, even if you manage to get in front of them. So I did release a product that just used the word bourbon. I could have called it a Tennessee whiskey if I want, but I made a choice to call it bourbon. And that was different for this brand, certainly. It was a big deal, but I think it was important and it's been successful for us.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you went from okay, we need to rely on education in order to reach consumers to
Yeah.
we need to simplify communication to
Yes.
reach consumers
Yes.
to we need to reach new consumers by simplifying communication and hopefully welcoming them aboard our brand. What was
That's
the,
exactly right.
yeah, like so releasing that George Dickel bourbon, what was the response like once it hit store shelves?
A bit of a how dare you, a bit of a I don't understand, like, well, what is this then? Is it different? Like, and a bit of excitement. Like for people who, for brand new, they're like, cool, like I can buy an 8-year-old bourbon that was, the number 5 whiskey in the world in 2021 for less than $40. Like, great, which I would say was most of the response. It's just like, wow, like what a great value for money. What a nice, like, bourbon. So mixed. It was a mixed bag.
That's interesting. And then like how I'm sure you're trying to figure out how to ask this question like delicately. So I'm just going to throw it out there, which is like when it comes to making decisions, about whether or not a product is successful and if a rollout's successful, how much are you paying attention to the niche, bourbon whiskey hardcore enthusiasts with the loudest bullhorns versus like the numbers of like how many bars and distributors are buying these things?
Yeah, that's one of my big challenges, I think, internally, inside the company, because they're so big that, to them, mostly success is like you grew to 1 million cases in like two, really fast. Like, oh, that's success. And so a lot of what I had to share and advocate for was, more of the whiskey enthusiast, more of the niche consumer, like that, getting them on side and on board and having them excited about what you're doing is the foundation and the first step to getting to 1 million cases. That whiskey, that in the same way that it takes a long time to make, it takes a long time to grow a brand here. Like people are just more loyal and they care more. And you have to get those folks on side first. And so that was a big part of what I was like convincing people of internally, that, I'm not necessarily going to release 1 million case whiskey in 30 seconds, but like I'm creating a foundation for growth. And now they see that now. Thankfully, I had a boss who also really understood like what I was doing and what I was trying to do. So he really like had my back, because there tends to definitely be an inclination for like, oh, you launched a whiskey and it's not like massive, in a year. Well, that's a fail. But we were growing, we were growing significantly. We were growing double digits. And when you pull that out, 10, 15 years, like there's a lot of potential here. So I had to do quite a bit of internal sort of lobbying to get people to see like why this is important and valuable.
I mean, it is interesting too. Like, I feel like in the spirits industry, and just from my very third party perspective, like, when you ask somebody like, "What do you drink?" Usually, it's like they have the one answer, or
Yeah.
here are the three things that I'll make, and drinking habits are I guess to be marketed most effectively need to be like habitual. They need to be recurring.
Yeah.
And to like get somebody to say like, I'm going to move away from this bourbon that I've been drinking for 20 years to like all of a sudden become a George Dickel enthusiast. Like that's a huge shift that takes time for growth.
That's absolutely true. And part of it, we're fortunate in that the industry also, as a whole, has shifted a little bit off of that, and people are becoming more exploratory in general. Like, becoming less like I'm a blank drinker and that's all I drink, and becoming a little more curious, a little more willing to try something new, which definitely it makes it at least a little bit easier. But then there's that fresh challenge of like once you win them over, they're not necessarily going to stay with you, right? So when you kind of, because they're being exploratory, they're not necessarily going to come back to you. So you have to always sort of have new news and have like something to talk about to bring those people back and keep them from like wandering off.
That's amazing. And um, now that you've been at Dickel for a while, like you're director of luxury and the
Yeah.
director of George Dickel, which is awesome. And like I'm curious about like now that you're past that initial sort of crises phase of like, all right, we're making these changes, blah blah blah, and you guys are seeing significant growth. I mean, in 2023, I think you won what was it, the Spirit Brand of the Year. I mean, for your
Yes.
entire profile of offerings, like that's a
Yes.
that's a huge transition from like from my research. It seems like the last awards that were won by Dickel were in 2015. You
Yeah.
know, so like to go from a part at which where you've got this kind of like historical brand, you're you're able to start to introduce new products that maybe you'll see within the decade, and you're
Yeah.
able to sort of change things around. Like, how has your approach to, running George Dickel changed now that you've got some time under your belt?
Yeah, now I think it's more about like we went through this big shift, this big period of like re-engineering, what kind of whiskeys we were making and what brands we would have and like how we were showing ourselves to people, how we were showing up. Now it's about kind of just the grind of like pushing that forward and doing the work to make it real. It's kind of more fun and easy, like in that moment of change, like there's so much moving around and you're doing stuff that's new and it's very exciting. And now it's a little bit shifted to just the grind of like making sure execution is right, making sure the brand is that the strategy that we've spent so many years coming up with and like laying the foundation for is actually getting executed. Which is a different, it's more about consistency. It's more about like expansion and scale and just the grind of making sure people are doing it right and like listening to you. So it's a little less sexy than the period of change, but this is what you have to do. Like this is where you're creating the kind of growth that's going to actually help this distillery survive long term.
Yeah, and can you give us some just an overview of like how big this operation is? I mean, how many people are you overseeing? What types of roles are you working with? Like,
Yeah. So it's funny, I have an interesting like hybrid role. There's not a lot of folks in Diageo, like they tend to be very siloed. So you're either like in marketing or you're in operations. And like never the two shall meet. So I have funny kind of responsibilities on both sides. In the distillery itself, there's about 50 folks who work there on shifts, but they don't I've put a distance between them and myself, which is actually one of the things I miss. Like they report to a team lead who reports to a site lead who like, you know, I approve like strategies and direct and define, but there's quite a chain, between like the person who comes in at 4 in the morning and turns the boiler on, and me. So I'm not overseeing them directly. I miss doing that, but I'm setting the strategy. I'm setting the like, how much of what type of thing are we going to make? Like, what does it mean for the whiskey to be good enough? Like, what is the quality? What kind of changes do we need to implement? What do we need to prioritize? Especially when we're making something new, like what is it? What is good enough? What kind of things should we be making? And then obviously all the mature stuff, like just doing the blending is still, that's the one piece that I keep for myself. Like no one else, I'm not giving it away, like me.
well, so well, hopefully this is a quick question, but like, so 50 people, fairly small
Yeah, it is.
operation, right?
Yeah.
That's not huge. How much, uh, how, how much product are you guys shipping around the world?
We're about a 250,000 case brand-ish.
Okay, and how does that compare to just the other brands in the market?
I mean, I think Jack Daniel's is like 12 million. So we are in this like funny, we're not one of the big whiskey brands, we're not up there with like Jack and Beam and like these behemoths that um, control the industry. We are a very small scale brand, but we are much bigger. Like the average craft distillery ships less than 5,000 cases, right? So we are much bigger than them, but very, very small compared to most like commercial distilleries.
Well, it's not a bad place to be in, especially when like the
No,
brands you're
it's fun.
comparing to are brands that have had, centuries to like be able to figure their thing out. And you
I
guys
mean,
are,
theoretically, so have we, but we haven't been quite as successful in figuring it out. Yeah, it's a funny thing. It is a nice place. It's a real like you're big enough. I kind of love being in this middle place because you're big enough that some economies of scale start to work in your favor. And like I can make an 8-year-old whiskey and sell it to you for $35, like which is not something a small distiller can typically afford to do. But I'm not so big that every decision has to be focus grouped to the nth degree. Like if I want to try something new, like it's not a huge commitment. Like it doesn't necessarily have to lead to like a million case brand, right? So it's small enough that it's sort of like the Linton Diageo's couch and I have a bit of freedom, but then big enough that I can like sell whiskey for a fair price. So it's a nice place to be. It's very freeing.
That's awesome. And then you just talked about the fact that the mixing is yours. You don't want to get rid of that. And
I
I'm
will
curious,
never.
and I'm curious about I'm going to ask both these questions together. Please answer them in whatever order you please. But I'm curious about one is like, what is your research and development process like? Like how, when you're going and you're being Dr. Frankenstein with whiskey, like, and bourbon, like, how are you coming up with the ideas, seeing it? And then part two of that is like, what is the relationship as you're designing things between taste buds and chemistry? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So I used to think when I came into this industry, I thought I could just like chemical engineer my way to the perfect whiskey, right? That I would just, you know, all the ego of like a 26-year-old, it's like I'm gonna solve all the things. I'm gonna make the best whiskey through like leveraging those engineering skills and logic. Um, I now realize that like the opposite is true, that the complexity of whiskey making is such that it's incredibly difficult to pinpoint the process origins of particular flavors. There's some things that we know. Um, it's not that we know nothing, but it's just so complex. Like you're using a raw material that comes out of the ground and not out of a lab, so it's just naturally variable when it arrives to you. And then there's so many steps along the way that process decisions influence how the final flavor turns out. And it becomes this like infinitely complex system that's really difficult to do proper science on. Like, you know, to run an experiment would take you decades, right? And like also the climate has changed. So actually you didn't manage to have a control really in that time. You're putting the finished whiskey in a barrel that's made out of trees that also had their own like separate life of things that happened to them. And the craft of barrel making is its own like incredibly complex thing. So it just becomes you kind of have to let go a little bit of that control and the idea that like you're going to be perfect. Um, and just try and like relentlessly pursue that perfection, but you're never gonna get there. Um, so always just trying to, I guess, like make the best whiskey that I can make in this moment. Um, you still like study those things, you still ask about it. We work on like there's a one thing I've been particularly interested in is this like spice character, it's like clove, cinnamony character that can sometimes show up in rye. It's really it was known to be kind of a real hallmark of American rye. And I wanted to understand where it came from because I actually wanted to do something different, like to turn that down instead of up. And it turns out it's really hard. Like you have some thoughts, some hypotheses of like where in the process it's generated, and then you actually go and do it and it doesn't quite match up. And like, that's been a 5-year journey to like try and get to the bottom of that problem. And I wouldn't say we've still really 100% solved it. So you have to be comfortable with that, which is tough for an engineer to do, but I am now.
yeah, and what are those? I mean, just once again, pardon my ignorance, but like, what do those procedures look like? I mean, is it one of those things where you're like, all right, cool, we put a gazillion barrels full of this product in there, and cool. In 6 months, I'm gonna go test the pH of one of them. Like, how
It's
are
all
you?
just sensory. It's sensory. There's no instrument that's as sensitive as a human nose. There's no instrument in our lab that will tell us if the whiskey is good or not good. Um, which is kind of, I don't think I will be replaced by AI, so that's comforting, right? But you can do some things like there's called GC mass spec analysis. So gas chromatography and mass spectroscopy is some analysis that you can use to try and understand like what compounds are present, but it's not going to tell you still whether it's going to smell like apple pie or dried apples or fresh apples or like it won't tell you if it's good or not good. So it's a tool that you could use to maybe understand like why is something different and maybe investigate like where in your process did that difference happen. But you can't go in, it's literally just sampling and nosing. Like, is it good? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? And the only way you can answer that is to put your nose on it.
Well, now that you've been at George Dickel long enough, I mean, first question, bluntly, are we starting to see products on the market that you designed?
Yes. The collaboration with Leopold Brothers is the first time we put whiskey that I distilled into a bottle, and that was so exciting. And it was just particularly exciting to use it for a product that's as like meaningful as that one. So yeah, that was hugely exciting for me.
Tell us about it. Like, what was the product? What happened?
It's an amazing whiskey. It's a long story. It's a long and I think incredible story. So this is a collaboration that I did with Todd Leopold. So Leopold Brothers is a small independent distiller in Colorado. And I had gotten to know him through my work at the American Craft Spirits Association, and the work I was doing on the federal excise tax and the legislative committee. And he is one of, I think, the most talented distillers in the US today, maybe in the world. And he has a huge passion for historic styles and historic whiskeys. And he's been on this like 15-year journey to resurrect this particular historic style of rye whiskey that uses a three-chamber still, which is a completely different type of still than most distilleries use, either a column or a pot, right? And like that's if you walk in any distillery, you're going to see one or both of those things or a hybrid of the two of them. And he found this document from the IRS from 1902 that had surveyed the existing distilleries and like really went into quite a bit of detail about their production methods and just discovered what was to him this really shocking bit of information that not only was there another type of still that none of us had ever heard of, but also it was the standard for making American rye whiskey. And American rye whiskey is the foundation of cocktail culture, right? Like it's just so integral to American like cocktails and drinking culture, and it's really revered for that reason. So it was quite surprising to him, I think, to find out like how little we knew about how it was made historically at that time and how different modern techniques were from those. So he was really excited by that and like went about the work of trying to resurrect this type of still. So the last three-chamber still that we know of that had been in commercial use was decommissioned in like the 40s. So there's no one you can ask. There's no one around that you can ask. So he went to the still manufacturer, Vendome, and basically convinced them to try and build him one of these. And they were like, "You're crazy. Like, we don't know if this is even going to work." And he ran one, did like years and years of work to try and figure this out. And it made this truly distinct distillate, this like oily, floral, like just such a different spirit, right? So hugely exciting, right? Like this is really distinct, but then also like it was pretty weird. He's as it's aging, it's like sort of getting weirder. He's starting to feel a little nervous and also like the point was to resurrect what whiskey tasted like at the birth of American cocktail culture. And as it's aging, he's like, I don't think this is it. Like this is kind of weird. And so this is the challenge of whiskey making. It takes a long time. And so he does more research and finds some process flow diagrams that indicated that the three-chamber still was used to create like what they called heavy bodied rye, but that the bulk of what was in a bottle was light bodied rye that came from a column still, right? And he didn't learn this until, a decade into his effort. And because time is what it is, like you can't go back in time and make column distilled rye. So that's how I got involved. He called me and said, could I help him like find some good like column distilled rye that would work for this? And also could I help him do the blend? Because, they'd never really done that. Like they're so small that they mostly did single barrels. And it was COVID time. I was like so excited to work on something interesting. And so that's the product that we launched together. It was this is as close as you can come to tasting what rye whiskey tasted like in the heyday of the birth of the American cocktail culture, which just how often in your lifetime do you get the chance to do that? Like that was wildly exciting. And what also really thrilled me was, they're an independent distiller. I work for the biggest spirits company in the world, and we are actually collaborating to make this happen. Like their brand is on the bottle. We don't own them. We're not going to buy them. Like we're buying the whiskey. They are profitable. Like they have cash flow for the first time in their history. Like, I think the small business we're helping them survive, and that feels really good.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like how many bottles of this product were sold?
We're I mean, thousands of cases, like not small. Small to Diageo, but big to a small distiller.
Well, and just, I mean, now I'm starting to understand more about this like history of, whiskey and the idea that like, oh, like this is like, it's always fun when you can just take something and go back to the oldest version of it that anybody could experience or the oldest process to experience something. I
Yeah.
mean, in Syracuse, like salt manufacturing from, like uh, a gazillion years ago, like we have companies now that are like trying to recreate that. And like
Yes.
that's just so cool that like we're seeing that especially for the first product you released, like
Yeah.
that was yours.
And it matters if it's better, right? Like sometimes you go and you like do all this research to like figure out historically how something was done, and you're like, this is just a less efficient way to make something that's either just the same or not as good, you know? And I definitely try and stay away from fetishizing like, carrying things in buckets or whatever, right? Like I'm all for if my worker doesn't have to climb up a ladder and can pump something up there, like good, like I don't need them to put themselves at risk to make the whiskey good. But man, when an old process, when it really gives you some different flavors, something that you didn't have before, when it really changes the whiskey, like that's thrilling. And when it makes it better, like Yahtzee. How often do you come across that?
Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about history and whatever, and the term regulations keeps popping up. And from what I
Yeah,
understand, Nicole, you are so obsessed with these things that you literally have a tattoo uh
it's
dem
true.
demonstrating one moment in history that you thought was really important.
It's true. Yes. I have a tattoo on my arm celebrating the 2017 Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act, which the CBMTRA, obviously, as everyone is, I'm sure, familiar, um, it was the product of also a decade of work. Um, on the part, so myself and Mark Schilling co-chaired the legislative committee for the American Craft Spirits Association. So we were obviously a really big part of that effort, but also a lot of work on, Discus and like the big distillers and a lot of other people that really got this started. And it was a huge effort. And we finally got it passed in 2017, which was, you know, let's just say that Schoolhouse Rock video about how a bill becomes a law leaves a lot out, right? It's a lot of complication. It took us forever. It was so long, like we didn't understand. And at the darkest days when it felt like maybe that was never going to happen, Mark and I were like, you know what? If we ever pass this, we're going to get a tattoo. And just to give you an idea of how unique and what a big moment this was, it's literally the first time in the history of the United States that the tax on distilled spirits has ever been lowered, ever. It created a graduated tax rate for small producers that gave them an 80% savings in their federal excise tax bill, which even for a really small producer, that's like 100 grand or more a year. That's a big number. That's an employee. That's the difference between being profitable and not. So even if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, there's still a legacy there that I'm really proud of.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, I applaud you for that. I mean, it's so cool that like, you a lot of people get obsessed with things and they're like very honed in on like one very specific moment. And in the spirits world, the craft beer world, whatever, like you see it all the time where it's like, somebody in their garage is like, I'm going to start microbrewing.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that they're interested in. And I just love the sort of holistic approach that you've had where it's legislation, it's tax reform, it's research and development, it's obsession with chemistry, it's marketing and communication. I mean, it takes a very special person to be able to take that and then bring it and house it into a place that's been around for over 150 years. So I applaud you, Nicole.
Thank you. I'm really bad at receiving compliments. That's very uncomfortable, but thank you.
You're so welcome. Well, I want to ask just one more thing about George Dickel
Okay.
before we talk about a couple other just mini things, which is you've got a bottle and bond product that should be on shelves by the time that this podcast airs. Can you tell
Yes.
us a little bit about this product?
So the Bottle and Bond is a regular release. So it doesn't come out on any particular schedule because it's the whiskey that drives these decisions, right? But the Bottle and Bond was the first innovation that I made in this role. So the very first one came out in 2019. And that year it actually won Whiskey of the Year. It was named the best whiskey in the world by Whiskey Advocate, which was a pretty big deal. like hitting a home run in your first at bat in the majors. It was wild. And this is now the fifth release. So it's the fifth iteration of the bottle and bond that I've done. It is so far, all of them have scored north of 90 points. I think this one just won a double gold at San Francisco. This is going to sound absurd, but I can't like keep track at this stage. But as my boss says, you win more medals than you sell cases. Like get it together. But it's this one is the foundation, I think, of the idea of my ethos of as a producer, like being authentic, being true, letting the whiskey be the central reason that you're doing something, like good whiskey first, whiskey quality, being honest and upfront and transparent about where it came from and what went into it, then trying to sell it for a fair price so that it can actually be, enjoyed and shared because that's what it's meant to do. So I think the latest one's pretty good. I'm really proud of it. So and there's less of it. So that's the one thing I would say is like if you find it, you got to grab it because there's way less of it than there was of number 4. Because when you prioritize quality, I can't always control how much there is. So I apologize in advance to anyone that can't find it. I'm sorry, but I'm already working on number 6.
Awesome. And if people are going to their local store, are they just asking for the George Dickel bottle and bond?
That's exactly right. Yep. And then if you really want to be nerdy and make sure it's like the 5th release and not the 4th, it says in the banners on the side of the label and also in the bottom right corner, like which release number it is. So if you really want to be a whiskey hunter and know which is which, that's how you find it.
I love it. So, Nicole, you've been so generous with your time. The last thing I kind of want to talk about, just goes back to your obsession as a kid with horses. And I'm, very curious about like, uh,
Not just as a kid.
not just that. Well, no, I think I'm a firm believer that you should follow. If I don't know, I heard a quote a couple years ago that was something along the lines of like, if you're struggling to find happiness, the thing you should do is ask yourself what brought you joy when you were 12. And I think that's like a good thing to consider. And I'm just curious about like now that you're in Tennessee, obviously like horse culture is plentiful. Like what is your relationship like now with horses and these four-legged rock stars?
They are so important to me. Um, the mental like health aspect of it is so important for me as well as the like physicality. It's so soothing and like mentally quieting to be with them. Um, focusing on something physical when so much of your job is mental. It's I just love it. I love them. We're all a little crazy, obviously, in our own way. Uh, Certainly, like, get hurt. As you age, you become a little more aware of, like, maybe it's not the most responsible way to be spending your time. And actually, I just recently had a really intense conversation about it with my husband because I've had some pretty serious concussions and, like, brain injuries. And we're really asking the question of, like, is it responsible for me to continue spending so much time and so much money and my neurologist pretty strongly insisted that I should maybe not do this anymore. And he his first thing he said was, "Oh, but you're so much nicer when you ride." And but I think it makes me happy and healthy and like, do you gotta have something to live for? It can't just be work. So I'm trying to like manage the risk as in every way that I can and just still love it. None of us are promised tomorrow, right? So you got to do what brings you joy today.
Yeah, and I've always admired the way in which I've seen you kind of approach horses, similar to the way in which you approach freaking everything, which is, riding is a part of it, caring for them is a part of it, making sure that the narratives of the horses is communicated to the world is a part of it. Like, there's so many facets of your relationship with horses that's just really interesting to look at from afar.
It's so satisfying to like it's a partnership, like it's a trust relationship you have to have with them. And when 1,200-pound animal trusts you to do these things, like they don't have to. I can't force her. Like she outweighs me pretty significantly. That for them to trust you is so satisfying. And then also for them to, I don't know, save you. It's funny at my last show, I totally biffed a distance, and my sweet sweet horse stopped at a fence, and she's like, but like caught me with her neck. And then like stood there while I got myself together. And you're just like, oh, thank you. Like, thanks for taking care of me. It feels good.
That's awesome. Well, Nicole, we've tackled a lot of different topics today. Before we kind of talk about where to follow you, is there any topics or ideas or thoughts that we haven't put forward that you want to throw out there?
No, I'm so glad we talked about the collaboration. I think that's the thing that I'm really like, I'm so proud of and excited to talk about. So I'm glad we got to chat about that. I think we've covered a lot.
I know. Well, I can't tell you how appreciative I am of this. For people who are interested in following your work, in seeing what happening at Cascade Hollow, who want to become more luxurious, to know from the director of luxury, like what are the best ways to find you or your work?
So on Instagram, we have at George Dickel and then also at Cascade Hollow Distilling Co. So that's the visitor center. So you see what's going on in the visitor center if you're going to come for a tour. We of course have a website, it's georgedickel.com. So also that has tour information. If you want to come and visit, the Instagram has a lot of stuff about like new brands, new releases. And then if you want to follow me, it's at Nicole Marie Austin on Instagram. Mostly horses and dogs. But occasionally I hint about whiskey work that I'm doing. Mostly my social media team reminds me like, hey, you should also like post about whiskey. I'm like, oh, you're right.
And I would just say for anybody who's out there who's the next time you're looking at spirits, like scope out the George Dickel stuff. If for nothing else, then like I always love your graphic design. Like it's got this like historical edge. I love the fact that like different elements are sort of raised and there's a textural component. Like it's a cool thing.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a piece of art, but it's for drinking, not for displaying. So just, I want to leave everyone with that. It's for enjoying.
Awesome. Well, Nicole, thanks so much for being on the show.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Nicole. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I have 8 years worth of patience built into me for a successful career. But kudos to her for being able to get into a place, start making waves, and then be able to see, all the cool results that come almost a decade later. And just some, behind the scenes conversations with her. It seems like there's a million other cool things coming her way. So keep tabs on Nicole Austin, and if you are so inclined, check out some of her work at your local spirit shop. Moving ahead, on September 11th, we have Mike Park coming on the show. So for anybody who is interested in punk, hardcore, ska, indie music, that name might ring a bell because Mike Park is the owner of Asian Man Records, which has been going almost 30 years. It started in 1996 and still to this day is run out of his parents' garage, but is a remarkable resource in the music community. Bands like Less Than Jake, Lemuria, Alkaline Trio, AJJ all got a start on Asian Man Records, and Mike is just an amazing advocate for music. So if you are somebody who is interested in the inner workings of running a record label, the sort of life of musicians, thinking about the transition from technology from 1996 to our time in 2024, this conversation is going to be for you. And once again, Mike Park coming in for episode 30 on September 11th. Equally, if you like what you heard on today's episode, I strongly suggest you check out the back catalog to see if there's any conversations that sort of resonate with you. Maybe you want to hear about neurodivergence in art and you want to listen to the interview with Kyla Yeager. Maybe you want to start at the beginning and you want to hear about a bunch of puppeteers who created an educational technology company with the Pinbox 3000 in episode 1. Maybe you want to hear about charity from our Valentine's Day episode. Maybe you want to learn about stop motion or voice acting with Mark Silk, Tim Allen. There's a bunch of really great content just waiting for you if you are a new listener. And if you're a returning listener, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to try to do some swag giveaways in the coming weeks, so please pay attention to the podcast and check me out on social media. You can find at Ryan Zlomek on Instagram and TikTok, The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook. You can email me, meditations@ryanzlomek.com. It's always wonderful to hear from you, to just see how these episodes are impacting you and your life. But without further ado, let's move forward and meditate on our day. Don't forget to make space for conversation because you just might learn something. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day.